Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MetrObelisk Radio. Today we are looking at the original Caped Crusader, The Shadow. Now I know that this movie was made because of the success of Tim Burton's Batman. Now what Tim Burton's Batman did was create the renaissance of the pulp hero. So why not bring one of, if not the most iconic pulp hero back to the big screen after so many years? The last time we ever saw the Shadow on the big screen was back in 1958 with the release of Invisible Avenger, and then in 1962 with the re-release of that movie retitled Bourbon Street Shadows. So with Alec Baldwin headlining this movie as Lamont Cranston, how does this movie stack up against Batman '89? Was this movie like the other movies inspired by Tim Burton's Batman in the sense that it only got its recognition after releasing the home video years and years later? And on top of that, is this movie even worth watching today? Now, before we get started, remember to follow the blog, metrobeliskradio.blogspot.com, link in the description, by the way, where you can stay caught up with all the MetrObelisk Radio uploads, no matter if they're exclusive to YouTube, BitChute, Library, or whatever other platform that you are currently watching or listening to this on. Now, with that out of the way, let's find out who knows what evils lurk in the hearts of men. And you know what? As I'm recording this, I just realized I cannot do this classic line any justice, so I'm going to need some help with this right about here.
Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows.
Now, before we dive into the movie, I wanted to first take a look at the history of the Shadow, and that's because the Shadow has a very unique history. The beginning of the Shadow actually begins in the year 1930. Street and Smith Publications wanted to boost sales of their magazine at the time that was called Detective Story Magazine. Now, for those who don't know, Detective Story Magazine would be one of the first pulp magazines running from October 15th, 1915, all the way through summer of 1949, and it would have a grand total of 1,057 issues during its lifetime. Now, Street & Smith hired Dave Chrisman of the Rothraff and Ryan Advertising Agency, and I apologize if I'm butchering any of these names, along with writer-director William Sweets to adapt the short stories from the magazine into a radio series. Now, Chrisman and Sweets thought that the radio series should be narrated by a mysterious storyteller with a very sinister voice. They now just needed to come up with a name, and this is where Harry Engman Charlotte, one of the scriptwriters for the radio series, jumps in when he kicks around some ideas for names that included the Inspector and the Sleuth, but obviously those didn't stick. Then he proposed the name The Shadow, and that is how The Shadow was born. He was created by an advertising agency looking for a narrator for their radio program, and on July 31st, 1930, The Shadow was narrating the first episode of Detective Story Hour. Now, shortly after this, Street and Smith, recognizing that there was a demand for The Shadow, commissioned Walter B. Gibson to begin writing stories about The Shadow. Now, Walter B. Gibson used the pen name Maxwell Grant and claimed that the stories were from The Shadow's private annals as told to him. Out of the original 325 tales of The Shadow, Walter B. Gibson wrote 282 of them over the next 20 years from 1931, basically writing a novel-length story twice a month. Now, the first story produced, The Living Shadow, was published on April 1st, 1931, and this would be the birth of what we know today as The Shadow. Now, the earliest radio drama for The Shadow would come out in 1937. Street and Smith entered into a broadcast deal with Blue Coal, and that was a coal company at the time that was based in Pennsylvania. And the show would air all over the Mutual Broadcast System, and on September 26, 1937, The Shadow returned to the radio with the episode Death House Rescue, with a 22-year-old Orson Welles voicing Lamont Cranston, aka The Shadow. Now, Orson Welles wasn't the first actor to voice The Shadow, but he was the first to voice the character that we now know as The Shadow. Now, he only stayed on for one season. That was September of 1937 up through October of 1938. and the radio drama would run from September 26, 1937 until December 26, 1954 on Mutual as a half-hour series on Sunday evenings. There was a daily comic strip that started in 1940 and ran until 1942, which contained 14 stories, all written by Walter B. Gibson. They were adapted straight from the Shadow pulps, and that would not be the only comic series pertaining to the Shadow. Street & Smith wanted to cross-promote their detective story magazine and attract a younger audience at the time to its other pulp magazines. So the first issue of Shadow Comics would be published in March of 1940 and would run until September of 1949. A Shadow story would lead off each issue, with the rest of the stories being based on other pulp heroes that Street & Smith owned, including, but not limited to, the Avenger and Doc Savage. Now, the Shadow would be revived in comic book form by Archie in the mid-60s. Then DC would revive him again in the mid-70s, going into the early 90s, with miniseries and a series that lasted 3 years from 1989 to 1992 that was called The Shadow Strikes, with the Shadow in quote-unquote modern New York instead of New York in the 1920s, 1930s. Now, Marvel published a graphic novel in 1988 called The Shadow, Hitler's Astrologer, that would take place during World War II, and Dark Horse Comics would pick up the rights to The Shadow in the early 90s and did a couple of miniseries with him. And currently, as of the recording of this episode, Dynamite Comics licensed The Shadow from Condé Nast. That's the same company that owns Vogue, that also owns the rights to The Shadow as of the recording of this episode. And also, The Shadow is no stranger to film, mind you. Universal produced 6 shorts based on the Detective Story Hour program with The Shadow as the narrator from 1931 to 1932. The first movie where we see The Shadow as we know him was produced in 1937, called The Shadow Strikes, that starred Rod LaRocque as The Shadow. Now, he would return for the sequel International Crime, produced in 1938. And yes, The Shadow even got his own serial in 1940, just called The Shadow, produced by Columbia Pictures. It was a 15-chapter serial where he's fighting the Black Tiger, a criminal mastermind that is sabotaging rail lines and factories all over the United States. This serial would see Victor Jory take over the role of The Shadow. And in 1946, Monogram Pictures produced 3 B-movie shorts that starred Kane Richmond as The Shadow. Those 3 films were called The Shadow Returns, Behind the Mask, and The Missing Lady. Now, the last Shadow movie was made in 1950 and was called Invisible Avenger, as I brought up in the very beginning of this episode. This movie was originally shot to be a TV show. The movie is a compilation of 2 episodes of that show. Now, this movie would be re-released in 1962 and would be titled Bourbon Street Shadows, and this movie would see Richard Durr take on the role of the Shadow. Now, to end this section off, because I know I've been going for quite a while, the Shadow has a very, very long history, quite obviously. He was insanely popular in the 1930s and 40s, hell, even going into the 1950s. I just wanted to illustrate for anyone listening who thinks that the Shadow was just this weird, obscure character or just this Batman knockoff. He wasn't. Characters like Batman and Darkwing Duck were heavily inspired by the Shadow. If you don't believe me, look into Batman's history. The creators don't deny it, with the exception of Bob Kane, but that's more because of Bob Kane. And also, take a look at Darkwing Duck sometime. The only difference between him and the Shadow is Darkwing Duck wears purple instead of black. Also, Alan Moore, creator of Watchmen, credited the Shadow as being the inspiration behind the character V in V for Vendetta, that also got turned into a movie with Natalie Portman and Hugo Weaving. And the Shadow was even an inspiration for the comic book crime-fighting hero known as the Silver Shroud in the Fallout video game series. I think the Silver Shroud first made an appearance in Fallout New Vegas, or it might have been Fallout 4, but don't quote me on that. Now that we've gone over the very long and illustrious history of the Shadow, let's get back to the 1994 movie that is the topic of today's episode. And as always, we're going to start off with the creative team. Now, this movie was directed by Muscle, if I can pronounce names today, directed by Russell Mulcahy. Now, he's directed a lot of music videos back in the 80s that include Fleetwood Mac's Gypsy, Duran Duran's Hungry Like the Wolf, and Billy Joel's Allentown. Now, most of you listening to this might know him as the director of Highlander and Highlander 2: The Quickening with Christopher Lambert and Sean Connery. He's directed other movies such as Ricochet with Denzel Washington and John Lithgow, Silent Trigger with Dolph Lundgren, and Resident Evil Extinction with Milla Jovovich. Now, the writers on this movie, the first writer credited is Walter B. Gibson. Obviously, he created the character The Shadow as we know him today. You know, that's why his name's attached on this movie. But the person who wrote the screenplay for the movie was David Koepp. Now, this man has written a lot of movies that you all might know and or love. He wrote the screenplays for Jurassic Park and The Lost World Jurassic Park. He's written other movies such as the first Mission Impossible movie with Tom Cruise and Jon Voight, Spider-Man with Tobey Maguire, Kirsten Dunst, and James Franco, Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and Jack Ryan's Shadow Recruit with Chris Pine and Kevin Costner. And a fun fact about David Koepp, by his own admission, he listened to the Shadow radio dramas as a kid when CBS was rerunning them on their radio stations back in the day. So at least the writer of the movie is familiar with the original source material. And a fun fact about the Shadow movie in general, as long as we're still on the creative team, Sam Raimi wanted to make a Shadow movie in the 80s. Yes, Sam Raimi, the guy behind the first Spider-Man movie with Tobey Maguire, Kirsten Dunst, and James Franco, also creator of Evil Dead, wanted to make a movie about the Shadow. But he was unable to secure the rights back in the 80s, so he made his own superhero instead, and that's how Darkman was made. And I mean, look at the character of Darkman, and look at the Darkman poster in particular. Darkman looks like he's inspired by the Shadow, and Sam Raimi would revisit the idea of a Shadow movie back in 2006. He had gotten the rights to the Shadow, and even approached Columbia Pictures at the time about doing it. Now, the movie obviously never got made, but it would have included other Street Smith pulp heroes such as the Avenger and Doc Savage. Now let's get on to our character analysis portion of this episode, and we're going to start off with the lead himself, Alec Baldwin as Lamont Cranston, aka The Shadow. Now in this movie, he starts off as a warlord and opium kingpin based in Tibet under the name Yin Ko. He is then trained by Tulku to become The Shadow. He is taught how to cloud others' thoughts, read their minds, and bend others' perceptions so that he cannot be seen except for his shadow, and he returns to New York City where he fights crime. Then we have John Lone as Shiwan Khan, who is the villain of the movie. He is the last descendant of Genghis Khan. He was another student of Tulku. Now, Tulku taught him the same things as Lamont Cranston, so he is on par skill-wise with the Shadow, and it's also revealed that he killed Tulku after he taught Shiwan Khan everything he needed to know. You know, a hero is only as strong as his villain, so Shiwan Khan, in my opinion, was a good villain for the Shadow to fight in this movie. Then we have Penelope Ann Miller as Margot Lane. Now, in the pulps, she is the love interest for Lamont Cranston. Now, they really don't get that far with her in this movie. In this movie, she's also telepathic, so much so that she's the only one to know that Lamont Cranston is the Shadow. And by the end of the movie, she becomes a companion of his to give him information. In fact, she's so telepathic that when Lamont Cranston tries to cloud her mind, he's unsuccessful in doing it. Then we get to Sir Ian McKellen as Reinhardt Lane. Now, he's the primary scientist in this movie, also the father of Margot Lane, herpa derp there. He works for the War Department, and secretly, he's building an atomic device for the U.S. government in this movie. What its purpose was, I don't remember. I think it had something to do with, weather. I don't really remember it off the top of my head right now. Now, this movie takes place in the late 1920s to early 1930s, so this is quite a few years before the development of the H-bomb. But let's be honest, you're building an atomic device, you're probably building a bomb. And I just now got myself on some watch list because I said bomb, ba-bomb, bomb, 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 bomb. Then we have Tim Curry as Farley Claymore. Now, he is Reinhardt Lane's assistant working with him on the atomic device. He does align himself with Shiwan Khan because Shiwan Khan promises him power that he's never had in his life. And finally, we get to Peter Boyle as Mo Shrievnitz, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced that name, but yes, Frank Barone himself is actually one of the agents of the Shadow. He's the personal cab driver for the Shadow throughout the movie, and throughout this movie, we see at least 3, maybe 4 different agents of the Shadow. Now, these agents of the Shadow are just regular people who have something to offer that the Shadow needs, whether it be a driver or a chemist or even a doctor. And I'll get into how one becomes an agent of the Shadow in just a minute. Now let's talk about the narrative of this movie, and the narrative is rather simple. Shi-Wan Khan comes to New York City in search of an atomic bomb so that he could usher in a new world order. Keep in mind that the Shadow was not only a pulp, but one of the first superheroes. A villain that has plans for world domination, especially given the original source material, doesn't surprise me in the slightest. Shi-Wan Khan being the last descendant of Genghis Khan, and that's exactly what Genghis Khan wanted to do when he was alive. If you don't believe me, look it up, what he wanted to do with the Mongolian Empire. Now, the Shadow has to intervene to save New York City from being blown off the face of the earth. How Shi-Wan Khan is able to keep this out of the public's eye is because he's hypnotized the entire city to believe that a building called Hotel Monolith was torn down before it could open. But as I said in the character analysis portion, Shi-Wan Khan got the exact same training that Lamont Cranston, the Shadow, got from Tulku. So that's what he used to trick the entire city. And now I did promise to explain how one becomes an agent of the Shadow. And this movie does show it in the very beginning. There was a guy in the beginning of the movie that the mob wanted to dump into the river with cement shoes. The Shadow saves him, and as a result, he owes the Shadow his life. Basically, he's in a life debt with the Shadow now. That guy in the beginning would be the chemist that works at NYU. I believe he was working at NYU since that's the only really big university in the city itself. I don't remember what other colleges in New York. I think Cornell is there, but I could be wrong. Please don't quote me on that, and if I'm wrong, don't be afraid to let me know. I can take it. Now let's take a look at this movie's reception. How was this movie received? This movie has a Rotten Tomatoes score of 35% based on 48 critic reviews, and an audience score of 44% based on 32,209 audience reviews. And this movie sits on IMDb at 6.1 out of 10 based on 22,970 reviews. And at the time of this recording, I cannot find this movie's Metacritic score, so we're just going to skip that portion entirely. Now, this movie was made on a budget of $25 million. That's in 1994 dollars. In 2020 dollars, that's a budget of $43,707,995.95. And it grossed $48,063,435 during its initial theatrical run. Not an outright box office bomb, but best case scenario, it barely made its budget back in the theaters. Now, the reviews for this movie were quite negative at the time. Owen Gleiberman wrote for Entertainment Weekly, quote, "The trouble with setting a special effects heavy fantasy in the low-tech 20s is that unless the American kitsch elements are injected with something approaching Steven Spielberg's speedy bravado, we become all too aware that the actors are simply standing around B-movie sets spouting cardboard dialogue." And Entertainment Weekly would later put this movie on their 21 worst comic book movies list. Now, one of the only positive reviews that this movie got was from Roger Ebert when he gave this movie 3 out of 4 stars and said, quote, "If you respond to film noir, if you like dark streets and women with scarlet lips and big fast cars with running boards, the look of this movie will work some kind of magic." Now, even though this movie didn't do well at the box office, it has since gained a cult following. It was a success on home video, on VHS, DVD, and Blu-ray at the time of this recording. The same thing happened to the other Batman 89 clones at the time. Those movies would be Dick Tracy, The Rocketeer, and The Phantom. Yes, there are more of them, but I have done episodes on all 3 of those movies specifically, Dick Tracy, The Rocketeer, and The Phantom. Links will be in the description below if you're curious about watching or listening to said episodes. Now, this movie wasn't all that bad. I know I probably sound like a broken record because I've said this about The Phantom, Dick Tracy, and The Rocketeer at this point. I've said this once or twice, and I'll say it again. The 1990s did not bring the superhero movie revolution, didn't bring back the genre. It brought back the pulp hero, like The Shadow, The Phantom, Zorro, Dick Tracy, etc. The superhero movie revolution, in my opinion, would not start until the year 2000 with the release of Bryan Singer's X-Men. That brought the superhero renaissance that brought us movies like X2, X-Men United, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Superman Returns, Batman Begins, etc. And I'll end the episode off with this. I believe that this movie got a lot of flack for being a quote-unquote Batman clone. It's too similar to Batman, therefore it must be a ripoff. As I brought up earlier in this episode, but I will reiterate it here, Batman was inspired by The Shadow. A lot of people who worked on the Batman comics, with the exception of Bob Kane, because Bob Kane's being Bob Kane, have not denied it. In fact, Batman and The Shadow had crossovers in the 70s. There were 2 of them, I believe. The first crossover was Batman number 253, published in November of 1973, where Batman teams up with an aging Shadow and calls the Shadow his, quote, biggest inspiration. They crossed over a second time in Batman number 259 that was published in December of 1974. In this crossover, we learned that the Shadow saved Bruce Wayne's life when the future Batman was a boy, and that the Shadow knew Batman's secret identity. Now, of course, with the Shadow, Bruce Wayne's secret is safe with him. Yes, DC added the Shadow to the Batman mythos. So why is the Shadow largely ignored in geek culture, you might be wondering? And simply, it's because he's been gone for too long. The last TV series on the Shadow was a visible Invisible Avenger. Try saying that fast 3 times and with, this much, rage kind of built up. And that was only 2 episodes long that got edited together to make a movie in 1958. Since then, Batman got insanely popular with the 66 series. He enjoyed a nice comic book run. He enjoyed an animated show. Obviously, the Tim Burton revival of the character. So on and so forth. And before I drag this out any longer than it needs to be, because oh my god, we've been going on The Shadow for over 22 minutes at this point. Without the popularity of The Shadow, there would be no Batman. There would be no Darkwing Duck, no Darkman, and no Silver Shroud. This character has had one of the biggest impacts on the popular culture, and most audiences don't realize it.